Rick Harrison woke up that morning just like any other day. The sun was out, the sky was clear, and everything seemed normal. He got dressed in his usual way, putting on a plain shirt, jeans, and his favorite watch, the same one he wore for years on the show. He didn't look nervous. In fact, he looked calm, maybe even a little tired, but not worried. No one could tell what was really going on in his mind. Maybe he thought he would just walk in, hear some serious words, and walk out like always. Or maybe deep down he had a feeling something big was coming, but he didn't show it. He arrived at the courthouse a little early. Reporters were outside waiting. Some were taking pictures. Others were shouting questions at him, but he didn't answer. He gave a short nod, kept his eyes forward, and walked through the doors. Fans watching the live stream noticed his slow steps and quiet mood, but they didn't think much of it. After all, Rick had always been calm under pressure. On TV, he handled crazy deals and wild customers. People trusted that he could handle anything. Inside the courtroom, it was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your heart beat louder. People sat still, waiting for the judge to walk in. Rick sat at the front with his lawyers. He looked around once, taking in the room. A few family members were there. Some close friends. Nobody smiled. It was as if time had slowed down. What made this moment so strange was that Rick didn't look like a man who was about to hear life-changing news. He sat with his hands folded, eyes looking down, sometimes blinking slowly like he was lost in thought. Maybe he was thinking about his shop back in Las Vegas. Maybe he was remembering a moment from his past or thinking of his son Corey. Maybe he was thinking this would all be over soon. The truth is, no one knows what was going through his mind at that exact moment, and that's what makes it so haunting. The calm in the room wasn't peaceful. It was more like the calm you feel just before a big storm hits. When the clouds gather, the wind goes quiet, and you know something is coming, but you don't know how bad it's going to be. That's what this moment was. Silent, slow, and heavy. Some fans online noticed the way Rick's lawyer whispered something to him. Rick nodded slightly but didn't speak. His expression didn't change. That small moment made viewers wonder, what did the lawyer say? Was it a warning, a last-minute detail, or was it something more personal? A word of comfort before everything changed. The judge walked in at last. Everyone stood. Rick stood too, straight and still. When everyone sat back down, you could almost hear every breath in the room. Then the judge began to speak. His voice was steady, formal. He read out facts, dates, and statements. Rick listened without moving much, but people who know him said they could see something shift in his eyes. The thing about Rick Harrison is that people always saw him as tough, smart, unshakable. On Pawn Stars, he could deal with pressure, handle money, and manage chaos with a simple look or a clever line. But here, in this quiet courtroom, under bright lights and in front of people who were waiting for justice or punishment or truth, he was just a man. A man about to hear a sentence that could change his whole life. And that's when the calm started to crack. Slowly, subtly. His breathing changed a little. He swallowed hard once. His hand moved slightly, like he was trying to stop it from shaking. Viewers caught it on camera, that tiny moment that told a bigger story. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was real. That's what made it powerful. There's something chilling about watching someone who's always been in control suddenly face something they can't fix, can't talk their way out of, can't buy their way around. It forces you to see the human behind the public face. And in that moment, the calm before the sentence, the quiet before the chaos, Rick Harrison wasn't a TV star or a businessman. He was just a person sitting in a room waiting for his future to be decided. What was he thinking? Was he hopeful, regretful, angry, afraid? We don't know. But the silence said more than words ever could. And that's what made it unforgettable. That's why fans couldn't look away. That's why this one small moment, so still, so quiet, started to go viral. Because sometimes the scariest part of a story isn't when the storm hits. It's when you're sitting under a clear sky watching the clouds roll in and realizing there's no place to hide. The moment the judge's words echoed through the courtroom, everything changed. The room, which had been so still, suddenly felt heavy. You could feel it in the air. The weight of the words, the gravity of what was about to happen. Rick Harrison had been sitting there quietly for what seemed like forever, listening to the judge, his face betraying nothing. He didn't show any sign of worry, fear, or even anticipation. But when the judge said those words, it was as if the entire world stood still for a second. The life sentence. Those words didn't just hang in the air, they struck like a thunderclap. Everyone in the room went silent, holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. And that something did happen. But not in the way anyone expected. Rick's face changed in a fraction of a second. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. A slight widening of his eyes, a small but deep breath, his hand twitching as though he were trying to hold on to the reality he knew. The room had been quiet before, but now it felt as though even the air was thick, as though it too had frozen for that one split second. His lawyers looked down at their papers, trying to maintain composure, but even they couldn't hide the shock. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. What was going through Rick's mind at that very moment? Did he think it was a mistake? Was he trying to convince himself that he had somehow misheard the judge? Or was he wondering what would happen next? The people who were there said he looked completely still. Almost like he had turned into stone. It wasn't the kind of reaction most people expected from someone in his position. People thought that if this happened to someone like Rick, he'd be ready with words, ready to defend himself. But instead, all he did was breathe. The sound of Rick's breath was almost louder than the judge's voice at that point. Everyone could hear it, though no one dared to speak. They all wanted to see how Rick would react. Was this the moment he'd break down? Was he going to explode in anger? Would he cry? But instead, he stayed quiet. He just sat there, letting the words sink in. In that moment, Rick wasn't just a businessman or a reality TV star. He was a man, a person who had just heard something that could ruin everything he had worked for. The whole world was watching him, waiting for him to make a move, to show some emotion. But he didn't. And that's what made it even more unsettling. The silence around him grew louder. The people who had followed Rick's story for years, from his days running the pawn shop to his rise to fame on the hit show Pawn Stars, couldn't understand what they were seeing. Was this the same Rick who always had a comeback, a smart answer, or a joke ready? Was this the same man who dealt with difficult customers and even more difficult situations on TV without flinching? It was hard to believe that this was the same person. This wasn't the Rick Harrison they knew from the show. This was someone different, someone who was feeling the full weight of what a life sentence meant. It was a moment that left everyone stunned, not just in the courtroom but across the world. The verdict didn't just affect Rick though. It was as if the room itself had been shaken, like a giant wave of confusion and disbelief had spread across everyone present. No one expected this kind of outcome. Everyone was shocked, but no one more than Rick. For a moment, it seemed as though time stood still. It was like the entire universe paused to give him a moment to process what had just happened. But as time passed, the reality of the situation started to sink in. This wasn't a small mistake or a little mistake that could be fixed with money or clever words. This was serious. Life-changing. The kind of decision that once made couldn't be undone. Rick must have known this. He had to. As the judge went on explaining the details, Rick just sat there. His eyes were fixed ahead, but his mind seemed miles away, caught somewhere between disbelief and acceptance. The reaction of those who were watching him closely was telling. Some said they could see the fear in his eyes, while others believed he was still in a state of shock, struggling to process everything. One thing was clear. This wasn't something Rick could control. He wasn't the one with the power anymore. In that moment, the power had shifted. And he was powerless. What made this situation even more complicated was the fact that the entire world was watching. The cameras were rolling, the journalists were writing, and the public was hanging on every word. It wasn't just a trial. It wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a reality, one that would affect his life forever. And the longer Rick sat there, not moving, not reacting, the more people wondered what was going on in his head. The room was full of tension, but it wasn't the kind of tension you see in movies, the kind where someone makes a dramatic speech or storms out in anger. No, this was the kind of tension that quietly seeps into the air, making everyone feel like they were part of something bigger, something that was unfolding in front of their eyes. Rick was used to being in control, to making decisions and moving things forward. But in that moment, all control slipped through his fingers. It was a helplessness that no one had ever seen before. Even the most confident person can feel powerless in the face of a decision like that. And that's what Rick Harrison felt, a loss of control. A moment when everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was suddenly out of his hands. The courtroom fell silent again. The only sound was the judge's voice as he gave further details, but everyone's attention was still on Rick. His face was still unreadable, but his silence said everything. The curiosity grew with every passing second. How would Rick Harrison react next? Would he speak? Would he fight back? Or would he just sit there letting the storm of this decision pass over him? No one could predict what would happen next. All eyes were on him, waiting for his next move. Would he stand up for himself? Would he show emotion, or would he simply fade into the background, defeated and overwhelmed by a decision that had shaken everything he believed in? This was only the beginning. There was more to come, and the world was waiting to see what Rick Harrison would do with the life sentence that had just been handed to him. Rick Harrison's reaction was everything, and yet it was nothing at all. In a room full of people, all waiting to see how he would respond, Rick's face didn't move much. It wasn't the dramatic outburst that many might have expected. It wasn't the shock or tears that sometimes follow devastating news. No, Rick's reaction was quiet, almost too quiet. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes. Anyone who has followed Rick's career knows that he is a man who can usually hide his emotions. On the show Pawn Stars, we've all seen him deal with difficult customers, awkward situations, and high-pressure deals with calm and confidence. He rarely lost his cool, and when things got tense, he knew how to keep things under control. But here, in the courtroom, there was no bargaining, no haggling. The decision had been made, and the life sentence had been handed down. When the judge spoke those words, Rick's expression didn't change immediately. For a brief second, his face seemed to be frozen, like someone who had been hit by a shock they couldn't process. His eyes widened ever so slightly, but then they quickly returned to their usual calmness. It was almost as though his face was trying to protect him from the reality of the situation. Maybe he didn't want to believe it. Maybe he thought if he didn't react, it wouldn't be true. But deep down, he knew. The weight of the life sentence was something no one could escape, and no amount of calm could change that. As Rick sat there, trying to hold on to his composure, the room around him seemed to grow even more intense. The silence stretched on, and all eyes were on him. People were trying to read his face, trying to figure out what was going on in his mind. Was he in shock? Was he angry? Was he trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense? The curiosity built with each passing second. What made this even more fascinating was the fact that Rick had always been known as the steady, level-headed figure. In front of the cameras, he was the one people trusted to keep things calm. In stressful situations, it was Rick who knew how to handle things. But now, for the first time, the calmness that had always been his shield seemed out of place. He wasn't in control anymore. And the fact that he didn't react in the way many might have expected, with tears, anger, or a burst of emotion, left people questioning even more. What was he thinking? Was he hoping that somehow it would all go away? Was he trying to remain strong for his family, his friends, or even for the millions of people who followed his life on TV? Did he want to show the world that he could handle anything, even this? It was a question that hung in the air. No one could be sure what was happening inside his mind, and that uncertainty only added to the curiosity. Rick's reaction wasn't what people were used to seeing. Fans who had seen him deal with so much on the show were now seeing a different side of him. The calmness that had made him a beloved figure suddenly felt out of place. Was this the Rick they thought they knew, or was there something deeper going on? Was he trying to keep his emotions hidden because he felt he had to, or was it that he simply couldn't process what had just happened? In the silence that followed the judge's statement, Rick's face became the focal point of everyone's attention. The cameras zoomed in, the reporters whispered, and the fans watching from their screens held their breath. It wasn't the tears, the shouting, or the outbursts that would go viral. No, it was the stillness in his face, the way he managed to keep his emotions locked away that captured people's attention. It was as if his face was telling a story without saying a single word. The most telling part of Rick's reaction was that it didn't feel like he was just sitting there in disbelief. It wasn't the kind of reaction you might expect from someone who had just been handed a life sentence. In fact, his lack of reaction made it even more chilling. It was as though he had already accepted what had happened, even before it was said out loud. Was it shock? Was it denial? Or was it simply the overwhelming realization that nothing could change the outcome? What was going on behind those eyes? Were they searching for answers? Were they filled with regret, anger, or confusion? The world would never really know. But what was clear was that in that moment, Rick Harrison wasn't just dealing with a life sentence. He was dealing with something much more profound. His identity, the life he had built, the legacy that had made him a household name. All of that was now at risk, and yet in the face of it, his expression barely moved. For those who knew Rick well, they could see the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the armrest a little tighter than usual. But these were subtle signs, and even then, it was hard to say whether they were signs of weakness or just the kind of reaction someone might have when they don't know how to react at all. It was the curiosity of not knowing that made this moment so powerful. Fans were left wondering, what did Rick really feel? Was he strong enough to handle this? Could he find a way out? Or was he truly broken by the weight of what had just happened? Rick Harrison had always been the person people looked to for answers, for calm in the chaos. He had a knack for keeping his cool when things got rough. But this was different. This wasn't a TV show, a pawn deal, or a negotiation with a customer. This was real life. And in that moment, Rick's face told a story that words never could. As time went on, people continued to analyze that single moment. Every twitch of his face, every small change in his expression, became the subject of conversation. Was he hiding his true feelings? Or was he just unable to express them? Was it fear, sadness, or a mix of both? The curiosity was almost unbearable. But in the end, it didn't matter what anyone thought he was feeling. What mattered was that Rick Harrison had just heard the verdict of his life, and somehow he had managed to keep his emotions locked inside, at least for the time being. No matter what happened next, that one moment would stay with him. It was a moment of stillness in a sea of chaos, a moment that spoke volumes without a single word. And that was something no one would ever forget. Rick Harrison sat there, his hands still resting on the table, the weight of the judge's words hanging heavily in the air. His life had just changed, and not in the way anyone could have predicted. In a single moment, his entire future, everything he had worked for, had been rewritten. The life he had built, the name he had made for himself, the millions of people who knew him from the TV show, all of it seemed to vanish in the blink of an eye. The life sentence was more than just a legal decision. It wasn't just a series of words spoken in a courtroom. It was the start of a new chapter, one that Rick had never imagined for himself. He had spent years building his empire, making smart moves, gaining the trust of his customers, and becoming a beloved figure on television. But now, none of that seemed to matter. The man who had once controlled a business empire with just his knowledge and wit, who had handled stressful situations with grace, was now facing something he had no control over. A sentence that could strip away everything he had worked for. What must have been going through Rick's mind? Was he trying to process what had just happened? Or was he thinking about the years he had spent building his pawn shop business and watching it grow into something bigger than he ever dreamed? Could he even believe that everything was about to fall apart in such a short amount of time? One moment, he was a man in control, surrounded by his family, his friends, and his empire. The next, he was just another person facing the consequences of a decision that he couldn't take back. The gravity of the situation must have hit him hard. But how could he process it? How could anyone? The more Rick sat there, the more it became clear that everything he had known, everything that made up his world, was shifting in an instant. The courtroom was no longer just a place where a verdict was being handed down. It was a place where his entire identity was being challenged. People who had known Rick only as a businessman, a father, and a TV personality were now seeing a side of him they had never seen before. This was the real Rick Harrison. The man who was facing the fallout of a life sentence. The man who in this moment had no control over what happened next. There was a strange feeling in the air as the crowd waited. Everyone knew that something big was happening. But no one knew how Rick would respond. The curiosity that built in the room was almost suffocating. Would he fight this? Would he try to negotiate his way out of it, the same way he would with a difficult pawn deal? Or was this something beyond negotiation? A sentence that no one, no matter how powerful or influential, could avoid. As the minutes passed, Rick remained still. His face was still, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. It was as if he were trying to mentally prepare himself for the reality that was crashing down around him. He had lived a life of strategy, of choices that had taken him from a small pawn shop in Las Vegas to international fame. But now, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the life sentence that had been handed down. His life was no longer in his hands. What was going through his head in that moment? Was he feeling regret for the decisions that had led to this point? Was he thinking about the people who would be affected by this, his family, his friends, and the loyal fans who had supported him for years? Or was he simply numb, unable to comprehend the reality of what was happening? The truth was, no one could know for sure. Rick wasn't giving any clues. His face remained unreadable. His movements minimal. The people who had followed Rick's life for years on TV, who had watched him handle everything from gold bars to rare collectibles, must have been shocked. How could the man who had always been in control of every situation, who could negotiate a price for a rare item with the skill of a seasoned expert, suddenly be rendered powerless? How could the Rick Harrison they knew be the same person who was now facing a life sentence? The truth was, in this moment nothing mattered except what was happening right now. No amount of money, no amount of fame, no amount of power could change the fact that Rick's life had been changed in an instant. The man who had been a trusted businessman and TV star was now a man facing the consequences of a decision that had come from somewhere deep within the system, a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. Rick had spent years building something that many people would envy, a life full of success and fame. He had a television show, a business empire, and a loyal following. People admired him for his sharp mind, his ability to read people, and his knack for getting the best deal. But all of that seemed to disappear in a single moment. The reality of a life sentence was something that couldn't be bargained with or negotiated. It wasn't something that could be fixed with money or charm. It was final, it was harsh, and it was a truth that Rick had to face, whether he was ready or not. The question everyone was asking now was, what would Rick do next? How would he respond to the reality of a life sentence? Would he fight it with everything he had, or would he accept his fate and try to move forward, despite the overwhelming odds? The world watched as Rick's story shifted from one of success to one of uncertainty. The life he had built, the empire he had worked so hard to create, now seemed fragile, as though it could all crumble away at any moment. But the most pressing question of all was, could Rick rebuild his life from this moment? Could he find a way to continue after everything he had known was turned upside down? Or was this the end of his story, the final chapter in a life that had once been filled with hope and promise? Rick Harrison was no longer just a man sitting in a courtroom. He had become a symbol of how quickly everything can change, how one decision can rewrite the course of someone's life. In that moment, he wasn't just facing a life sentence. He was facing the destruction of everything he had worked for, everything he had built. And how does one even begin to deal with that? The people watching from around the world were left with more questions than answers. What would happen to Rick Harrison after this moment? Would he be able to find a way out, or would the life sentence become the final sentence in his journey? The world waited, and in that silence, Rick Harrison's life was being rewritten, and nobody knew how the story would end. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. It wasn't just the kind of quiet where you could hear the rustle of papers or the occasional cough. No, this was different. It was the kind of silence that seemed to hold everything in place, like the entire world had stopped moving for a brief moment. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were holding your breath, waiting for something to happen, but nothing happened. At least, not right away. Rick Harrison was still sitting there, his hands resting calmly on the table, his face unchanged. His eyes were focused on something ahead of him, but they didn't seem to be seeing anything. The people around him were waiting. They didn't know what to expect, but they all felt the weight of what had just been said. The life sentence had been handed down, and the reality of it was sinking in for everyone in the room. The tension was so thick you could almost feel it pressing down on your chest. This was the moment when time seemed to stretch on forever. Everyone was trying to understand what had just happened, what it meant, and what would happen next. But Rick didn't say a word. His stillness seemed to fill the room, making everyone else feel uneasy. How could someone who had been so in control for so many years sit there so calmly in the face of something so life-changing? The questions raced through everyone's mind, but no answers came. What was Rick thinking in that moment? Was he processing everything that had just been thrown at him? Was he replaying the events that had led to this point? Or was he simply waiting for the right moment to speak, to explain himself, to offer some kind of response? The curiosity around him only grew stronger. People watched, almost hoping that Rick would give some kind of sign, a clue about how he was truly feeling. But there was nothing. His face remained still, unreadable. The silence didn't just affect Rick, it affected everyone. His lawyers, who had been so confident earlier, now seemed at a loss for words. They exchanged glances, but they knew there was nothing they could do to change what had just happened. The judge had spoken, and the life sentence was final. The defense team was powerless now. The prosecution, on the other hand, seemed almost relieved. The tension they had been holding onto for so long had been released. But even they couldn't escape the weight of the situation. There was no cheering, no celebration. This was not a victory, it was the end of something much bigger. In that moment, everyone in the room seemed to realize that the world as they knew it was different now. Rick Harrison was no longer the man everyone had seen on TV, the one who dealt with tough situations with ease, the one who could navigate any problem with a clever remark or a well-timed joke. He was now facing the harsh reality of a life sentence. And the silence in the room was the only thing that could convey just how serious and final that reality was. As Rick sat there, it was hard to tell if he was truly aware of how the world was watching him. The cameras were still rolling, the reporters were still scribbling notes, and the public was waiting for the next chapter of his story. But there was no dramatic outburst, no angry words, no emotional speech. There was just Rick, sitting quietly, his face calm and still. His silence was loud. It spoke more than any words could. It wasn't just the silence of a man who had been defeated, it was the silence of someone who was processing the unthinkable. Was he trying to make sense of the situation? Was he hoping that somehow it would all turn out to be a mistake? Or was he just accepting it, knowing that there was nothing left to do but sit there and face the consequences? The curiosity surrounding his reaction grew with every passing second. As the minutes ticked by, the silence became even more unbearable. The tension in the room built to a point where it felt like it could snap at any moment. The reporters, the lawyers, the witnesses, everyone in the room was caught in the stillness. They were all waiting for something, but what were they waiting for? What could possibly happen next? Would Rick speak? Would he stand up and give a speech? Would he ask for mercy? Or would he remain silent, accepting his fate in the way that he had accepted so many other challenges in his life? But no one could have predicted the answer. Rick didn't speak. He didn't rise to his feet or make any attempt to argue. He didn't beg for mercy, nor did he lash out in anger. Instead, he simply sat there. The silence stretched on, and the people around him began to realize that this was it. This was the moment when everything had changed. The man they thought they knew, the man who had always known what to do, was now facing a fate he couldn't control. What was going through Rick's mind? Was he angry at himself? Was he regretting the choices that had led to this moment? Or was he simply resigned to the fact that this was the way things had to be? Could he find any way out, or had he already accepted that there was no escaping the life sentence? The questions were endless, but there was no way to know the answers. Rick's silence was a barrier, keeping everyone from understanding what he was truly feeling. The people in the courtroom weren't the only ones left in suspense. The fans who had followed Rick's journey, the millions who had watched him on TV, were now all waiting to hear his side of the story. How would Rick react to what had just happened? Would he try to explain himself? Would he address his fans, the people who had supported him for so long? Or would he simply disappear, leaving the world to wonder what had happened to the man they thought they knew? The courtroom remained silent. The tension was palpable. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone was waiting. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for Rick to say something, anything. But he didn't. The silence stretched on, longer than anyone had expected, leaving everyone to wonder what Rick was thinking, what he was feeling, and what would happen next. In the end, it wasn't the words that would define this moment. It was the silence. The heavy, suffocating silence that filled the room and hung over everything. The silence that left people wondering if Rick Harrison, the man who had always been in control, had finally met his match. The silence that made everyone realize that nothing, not fame, not money, and not even the power of a TV show, could change the reality of what had just happened. As the sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, Rick Harrison's world began to unravel in a way no one could have predicted. It wasn't just the end of his career as a businessman, or the loss of his empire, it was the beginning of something far worse. The real consequences of the life sentence were beginning to sink in. It wasn't just about the years he might spend behind bars. It was about everything else that would be stripped away from him. The people, the lifestyle, the reputation. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore, it was personal, and that was the part that was going to hurt the most. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but Rick's face was still calm. He had become the center of attention, not by any action of his own, but by simply existing in that space. The world had turned its eyes to him, and it was clear that everyone was trying to understand what had just happened. It wasn't just the legal aspect of it. It was the idea that a man who had built his life around the American dream was now facing the consequences of a decision that could tear everything apart. What would happen to his business? What would happen to his family? What would happen to the life he had so carefully built for years? These were the real consequences. The court decision was just the tip of the iceberg. The ripple effects of that verdict would go far beyond what anyone could see in the courtroom that day. As the minutes stretched on, Rick must have been reflecting on the life he had lived. He had spent years building something that had come to define him. People knew him as a successful businessman, a TV personality, and a man who had made a name for himself through hard work and determination. But now, all of that seemed irrelevant. The life sentence had wiped the slate clean, leaving only the harsh reality of what lay ahead. In that moment, the curiosity about what was going on inside Rick's mind must have been intense. How could someone who had always been in control now be faced with such a loss of control? Rick had never been the kind of person who backed down from a challenge, but this was different. This was a challenge that no amount of bargaining, no amount of business savvy, could change. The consequences of his actions weren't something that could be dealt with in a negotiation. They were final, they were life-altering. The real question everyone wanted to know was not just about how Rick would handle his time behind bars, but how he would handle the emotional toll. How would he cope with the fact that his empire, his fame, and his place in the world were now gone? Could he rebuild? Or was this the end of the road for him? The thought of spending the rest of his life in prison was unbearable for anyone. But for someone like Rick, who had built so much, the consequences of that sentence were even more significant. Rick wasn't just facing a loss of freedom. He was facing the loss of everything he had worked for, everything that had given him a sense of purpose and identity. The fans who had admired him, the people who had looked up to him, how would they react to the news? The real consequences would not only affect Rick, but everyone who had been part of his journey. It wasn't just about the courtroom anymore. It was about the world outside, the people who had followed his story, and the legacy he would leave behind. Would his family stand by him? Would they be able to endure the consequences of his actions, knowing that their lives were going to change in ways they couldn't control? Rick must have been wondering about that too. How could he face the people who had supported him all these years, knowing that he had let them down? That was the real emotional weight of the situation. The curiosity surrounding Rick's response to this overwhelming loss was building by the second. What would he do next? Would he try to explain his actions? Would he attempt to justify himself? Or would he accept his fate and remain silent? The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Everyone wanted to know how he would react, but in that moment, Rick wasn't speaking. It was clear that the weight of the consequences was too much to process all at once. For the fans who had watched Rick on television, the news must have been a shock. He had been the face of a successful show for so many years. He had become a household name, but now that name was forever tied to something else. His legacy would never be the same. The consequences of that life sentence would haunt him for the rest of his days, and no amount of fame or money could change that. Rick was no longer just a TV personality. He was a man facing the consequences of his actions, and no one knew how he would handle it. Would he be able to pick up the pieces of his life, or would he be consumed by the reality of his situation? The world was waiting, but Rick was silent. His face was still unreadable, and the questions continued to build. Was he going to fight? Was he going to give up? The silence was maddening. It was as if the world had stopped turning, leaving Rick suspended in time, unable to move forward or backward. But beyond the personal consequences, there were other things that would change as well. Rick's business, once a thriving empire, would now face uncertainty. Would his family be able to carry on the legacy of the pawn shop without him? Would the name Rick Harrison still hold any weight in the business world? These were the questions that loomed over everything, the questions that no one had answers to yet. The real consequences of Rick's life sentence weren't just about prison time. They were about the destruction of everything he had built. His legacy, his career, and his relationships, all of these things were now in jeopardy. And as Rick sat there in that courtroom, the weight of it all must have been overwhelming. The life he had once known was now gone, and no one knew what the future would hold for him. Could Rick find a way to rebuild? Could he ever regain the trust of his fans, his family, or even himself? The real consequences of the life sentence had only just begun, and no one could predict how it would all unfold. But one thing was certain: Rick Harrison's life would never be the same again. The world had changed, and so had he. The question now was, what would he do with the life that remained? As time passed, the story of Rick Harrison would continue to unfold. The consequences of that life sentence would follow him wherever he went. And the world would continue to watch, waiting to see how the man they thought they knew would react to the harshest reality he had ever faced.